She was 34 years old, and by the first hard frost of 1888, she had nothing left in this world but a name nobody wanted and $11.40 sewn into the hem of her only good dress. It was her husband's brother, Silas Coyle, who put her out, claiming the farm for debts she had never seen a ledger of, debts he swore her late husband owed him, though no one in Harlow's Bend, Tennessee, ever saw a paper to prove it. With that handful of coins and the clothes on her back, she did the one foolish, desperate thing a woman with nothing does when she still wants, more than anything, to belong somewhere. She went to the county auction and bought the old condemned smokehouse behind the Tanner place for $3, a leaning structure of blackened brick that the whole town had long since written off as good for nothing but kindling. But sealed behind its crumbling chimney, wrapped in oilskin and waiting for nearly 20 years, was a truth that would not only change the rest of her life. It would give an entire town back a name it had spent a generation trying to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ruth and Coyle. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, too small, too poor, too overlooked to matter, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Ruth Anne had been born Ruth in Whitfield in the spring of 1854, in a modest cabin at the edge of a hollow where the Cumberland foothills folded down into creek bottoms thick with sycamore and sweet gum. Her father, Amos Whitfield, was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and he raised his only daughter the way he raised his hogs and his tobacco, with patience, with attention, and with the belief that nothing worth having came without tending. He taught her to read a ledger before she was 10, to keep accounts in her head faster than the store clerk in town could work as abacus, and to never, ever let a debt go unwritten, because an unwritten debt, he told her, was a lie waiting to happen. Her mother, Louisa, taught her other things: how to salt a hog shoulder so it would keep through a wet winter, how to hang meat so the smoke curled through it evenly, how to listen to a neighbor's silence and hear the trouble underneath it. Ruth Anne grew up watching her mother carry baskets of cornbread and dried apples to families whose barns had burned or whose men had gone off to war and not come back, and she absorbed, without ever being told outright, that a person's worth was not measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to share when they had almost nothing themselves. The hollow they lived in had once been home to a much larger community than the one Ruth Anne knew as a girl. Older folks spoke sometimes, in low voices, of a settlement of freedmen who had lived along the creek bottom in the years just after the war, families who had cleared land, built a smokehouse cooperative, and sold cured meat and salt pork as far as Chattanooga. But by the time Ruth Anne was old enough to ask questions, that settlement had dwindled to nothing, its cabins fallen in, its people scattered or gone, and nobody in Harlow's Bend seemed to want to talk about why. It was simply understood, the way certain silences are understood in small towns, that the subject was closed. She married young, at 19, to a quiet, steady man named Josiah Coyle, a carpenter's son with gentle hands and a habit of humming old hymns under his breath while he worked. Josiah's older brother, Silas, had already inherited the bulk of their father's land and had built himself into something of a fixture in town, a man who sat on the church board, who lent money at interest to farmers in thin seasons, who was, in the way of certain men, always careful to be seen doing good in public while doing something else entirely behind closed doors. Ruth Anne never trusted him, not fully, though Josiah always defended his brother, calling him hard but fair. She and Josiah built a small farm of their own on 40 acres just outside town, and for 11 years they worked it together. Corn, a few hogs, a kitchen garden, Ruth, and kept so productive that women twice her age came to her for seed and advice. She bore 2 children. Both were lost in infancy, a grief she carried quietly and never let harden her, though it left in her a particular tenderness toward anything fragile and overlooked, anything that seemed too small or too broken for the world to bother saving. Josiah used to say she had a gift for finding the good in things everyone else had thrown away: a cracked churn, a lame mule, a rusted plow blade, and turning them useful again. It was, he told her once, the finest thing about her, and the thing he loved best. She learned bookkeeping properly during those years, too, taking in accounts for 2 of the smaller merchants in town when money was tight, And it was there, bent over columns of figures by lamplight, that she discovered she had her father's gift doubled. She could smell a false entry the way other people smelled rain coming. She never imagined, in those years of modest contentment, how completely that skill would one day matter, nor how soon she would need every ounce of her mother's compassion and her father's precision both, in a single winter that took everything from her at once. Josiah died of a fever in the autumn of 1886, quick and cruel, and Ruth Anne buried him in the churchyard beside their two infants, and told herself she would manage, because managing was what her mother had taught her to do. For a year she held the farm together alone, rising before dawn, working past dark, refusing every neighbor's suggestion that a widow alone couldn't keep 40 acres running. And for a year, she proved them wrong. But Silas Coyle had never liked being proven wrong by anyone, let alone his brother's widow, and in the spring of 1888 he arrived at her gate with the sheriff and a stack of papers claiming that Josiah had borrowed heavily against the farm years before. Money, Silas said, that Ruth Anne now owed him, with interest compounded so steep that the only way to settle it was to sign the land over entirely. Ruth Anne asked to see the original note in Josiah's hand. Silas produced only a copy, in his own writing, with Josiah's signature at the bottom, looking stiffer and more careful than her husband's hand had ever been in 11 years of shared correspondence. She said as much, plainly, in front of the sheriff. It did not matter. Silas was a deacon and a lender and a man other men in town owed favors to, and Ruth Anne was a widow with no living kin to stand behind her. Within 2 weeks the farm was his, the furniture sold off to cover what he called remaining costs, and Ruth Anne stood on the road outside the house she had built her whole married life inside of, holding a single carpet bag and $11.40 that she had managed to hide, sewn into her hem before the sale. She did not weep in front of them. She had learned that much from her mother, too. That grief shown too plainly to people who wish you ill was a kind of gift you gave them, and she would not give Silas Coyle the satisfaction. She walked into town with her chin level and her back straight, and it was there, 3 days later, standing at the edge of the county auction where the last of the unclaimed and condemned properties were being sold off for whatever anyone would pay, that she first laid eyes on the old smokehouse behind what had once been the Tanner place. It was a squat, blackened building of brick and hand-hewn timber, its roof half caved in, its door hanging on one hinge, choked all around with blackberry bramble that had grown up wild and thorny in the years since anyone had troubled themselves over it. The auctioneer barely gave it a mention. A derelict outbuilding. He called it, condemned for tax purposes, sold as is, no warranty of any kind, and likely fit only to be torn down for its brick. Nobody bid. Nobody wanted it. It sat behind land that had already been sold off in pieces to 3 different owners, none of whom cared to claim the smokehouse itself, since the plot it stood on had been carved out separately in some old and forgotten survey. When the auctioneer finally, almost apologetically, asked if anyone would take it off the county's hands for $3 just to be rid of the liability, Ruth Anne heard herself say yes before she had entirely decided to. She told herself, walking up to pay, that it was simply shelter, for walls and a roof, however broken, were more than she had. But some other part of her, the part that had spent her whole life finding value where others saw only ruin, felt something else entirely, a pull toward that ugly, blackened little building that she could not have explained to anyone who asked, and several people did ask, shaking their heads at the widow Coyle throwing away good money, what little she had left, on a heap of condemned brick that even the county didn't want. "You'll regret this," old Ferris Boone told her outside the courthouse steps, not unkindly, but with the particular pity reserved for people everyone assumes have finally lost their good sense. "That old smokehouse has been sitting empty longer than my boy's been alive. Ground's likely poisoned with salt and lie besides. You'd be better off sleeping in the church loft than in that." Ruth Anne only thanked him for his concern and walked the 2 miles out to her new property with her carpetbag over her shoulder, arriving as the light was going golden long across the creek bottom, to stand for the first time before the thing she now owned outright, free and clear, the only piece of ground in the world that was entirely hers. The inside of the smokehouse smelled of old smoke and older rot, a scent that seemed to have soaked so deep into the brick over the decades that Ruth and suspected it would never fully leave, not even after 100 rains. The floor was hard-packed dirt, uneven and littered with fallen shingles and the husks of wasp nests long abandoned. Rafters above her, blackened almost to char from decades of curing fires, sagged in the middle where rain had gotten in through the broken roof, and half the south wall had crumbled to rubble at some point in a storm nobody had bothered to repair. But the chimney, a great, wide hearth of fieldstone and brick built up nearly to the height of a grown man, clearly meant for a serious operation, not a household's yearly hog, stood mostly intact, as if the whole structure had been built around the idea that the chimney, at least, must never fail. Ruth Anne spent that first night huddled beside it, wrapped in her one blanket, listening to the wind work through the gaps in the roof, and telling herself that whatever came next, she had a floor under her and walls around her, and that would have to be enough. It was on the third morning, while clearing rubble from the collapsed wall to shore up what remained of the roof, that she noticed something odd about the brickwork on the chimney's northern face. The bricks there were laid in a slightly different pattern than the rest. Not the simple running bond used everywhere else in the structure, but a deliberate, almost decorative arrangement, with one section near the base set noticeably proud of the surrounding wall, as though it had been bricked in after the original construction rather than as part of it. Ruth Anne might never have noticed at all had she not spent 11 years watching Josiah work stone and timber, learning without meaning to the particular grammar of things built carefully versus things built in haste. This section had been built carefully, and it did not belong. She worked at it that afternoon with a flat iron bar she found half buried in the rubble, prying gently at the mortar, which crumbled far more easily than a mortar elsewhere in the chimney. Newer, she realized, or simply softer, made perhaps in haste or with different lime. After nearly an hour of patient, careful work, 3 bricks came loose in her hands, and behind them, in a cavity no larger than a bread box, wrapped in a sheet of oiled canvas gone stiff and dark with age, she found a bundle that had been waiting, she would later calculate, for almost 20 years. Her hands trembled as she carried it out into the daylight and set it on a flat stone, and for a long moment she simply looked at it, this small, unassuming parcel that someone had gone to such trouble to seal away from the world. When she finally unwrapped the oilskin, she found inside a leather-bound ledger, its pages foxed with damp, but the ink still largely legible, a folded packet of letters tied with wax string, and at the very bottom, a stiff paper folded in quarters that, when she opened it with the greatest care, revealed itself to be a land deed, a genuine, counter-recorded land deed, dated 1868, granting 42 acres of creek-bottom land, including the smokehouse and its outbuildings, to one Emmett Free, and his wife, Delia Free, free and clear, in consideration of services rendered and payment received in full. Ruth Anne sat down hard on the flat stone beside her discovery and read the name again. Free, Emmett Free. She had never once, in her whole life in Harlow's Bend, heard that surname spoken by anyone. Not her father, not her mother, not the oldest gossips at church who could recite 3 generations of every family in the county without pausing for breath. And yet here, in her own 2 hands, was proof, official and dated and sealed, that a man named Emmett Free had once owned this very ground, 42 acres of it, outright and legal, 20 years before she had ever bought 3 ruined acres of it back for $3 at a tax auction nobody thought was worth attending. She opened the ledger next, and it took her the better part of that whole first week, working by daylight since she had no lamp oil to spare, to make sense of what she was reading. It was, she came to understand, the account book of a cooperative, the Free Family Curing Company. The ledger called it in careful, looping script, established in the spring of 1867 by Emmett Free, a man born enslaved on the old Harlow plantation who had, upon emancipation, worked for 2 years as a hired hand curing meat for his former owners before striking out with his wife and 3 other freed families to build something of their own. The ledger recorded, in patient, meticulous detail, the growth of that enterprise. Hogs bought on credit and paid off within a season. Smoked meat and salt pork sold, not just locally, but shipped by wagon as far as Chattanooga and once, remarkably, all the way to Knoxville, profits divided among the founding families according to a system of shares that Ruth, and, reading it with her father's trained eye, recognized as more fair and more carefully documented than half the business arrangements she had ever kept books for among white merchants in town. By 1870, the ledger showed the Free Family Curing Company employed 11 people and supported 6 households, and its meat had won a ribbon at the county fair 3 years running, a fact recorded with evident and understandable pride in Emmett Free's own hand. And then, abruptly, in the spring of 1871, the entry stopped. The letters, when Ruth had finally worked up the nerve to untie the wax string and read them, told her why, though it took her longer than the ledger, had to understand the full shape of the wound. They were letters between Emmett Free and a lawyer in Knoxville, a Mr. Aldous Pruitt, and they documented a legal dispute, a claim brought by none other than Cornelius Harlow, the son of Emmett Free's former owner, and Ruth Anne realized with a chill the direct ancestor of the very Harlow family for whom the whole town, her town, was named. Cornelius Harlow had claimed in court that the original land grant to Emmett Free had been improperly recorded, that a surveying error placed the boundary in dispute, and that the smokehouse and surrounding acreage in fact belonged to the Harlow estate. The lawyer's letters made plain that the claim was thin, legally speaking, resting on a single altered survey mark that Pruitt suspected, though he could not prove, had been changed after the fact. But thin claims, brought by a wealthy white family against a black man's title in a Tennessee courtroom in 1871, did not need to be strong to succeed, and the last letter in the packet, dated November of that year, informed Emmett Free with evident regret that the court had ruled against him, that the land was to revert to the Harlow estate, and that Emmett and his family would be required to vacate the property within 60 days. There the letters ended. But behind them, in the very bottom of the oilskin wrapping, Ruth Anne found one final page, written not in the careful business hand of the ledger, but in a looser, more urgent script, clearly composed in haste. It was addressed to no one in particular, and it read, in part, that Emmett Free did not know who might one day find this chimney's hidden stones, but that whoever did should know the truth the court had refused to hear, that the land had been his, fair and earned, that the meat his family cured had fed half the county through lean winters without complaint or thanks, and that he was leaving this record sealed in brick because he trusted brick and stone to outlast a courthouse as convenient. Forgetting, he asked only that if the truth ever surfaced, it be told plainly, and that his family's name, Free, chosen deliberately by his own father upon emancipation, he wrote, because it was the truest name a man could give his children, not be allowed to vanish from the ground his family had cleared with their own hands. Ruth Anne sat with that letter until the light failed entirely, and when she finally lay down that night beside the great chimney that had kept the secret faithfully for 2 decades, she understood, with a clarity that steadied something shaking inside her, that she had not simply bought a ruin. She had inherited a debt of memory, and she intended, whatever it cost her, to pay it. The difficulty, she quickly discovered, was that paying a debt of memory in a town built on forgetting was not a simple matter, and it did not take long for Harlow's Ben to notice that the widow Coyle was asking questions nobody had asked in 17 years. She began carefully, visiting the county records office in the seat town to confirm what the deed and the court letters described, and there, cross-referencing survey maps with the patient thoroughness her father had drilled into her over ledgers of hog weights and tobacco yields, she found exactly what Mr. Pruitt's letters had suspected but never proven. The original 1868 survey, still on file, dusty and unconsulted for decades, showed a boundary line that matched Emmett Free's deed precisely. In a second survey filed in 1871, the one used to justify the court's ruling against him, had clearly been altered, a boundary stake moved on paper, if not on the actual ground, by nearly 60 rods, in a hand the clerk on duty admitted, after some reluctant study, did not match the original surveyor's signature at all. Word of Ruth Anne's visits to the county seat traveled back to Harlow's Bend faster than she did, and by the time she returned, she found that Cornelius Harlow's grandson and namesake, the current Cornelius Harlow, a stern, silver-haired man who sat at the head of the town council and held the mortgage on half the farms in the valley, including, she now understood with grim clarity, the very notes Silas Coyle had used to justify seizing her own land, had already sent word that he wished to speak with her. He received her in his study with a courtesy so polished it felt like a kind of warning, offered her coffee she did not drink, and told her, in the gentlest possible tone, that whatever old papers she believed she had found in that condemned smokehouse were surely mistaken, the confused ramblings of a bygone dispute long since settled by the courts, and that it would be a kindness to everyone, herself included, if she simply let the matter rest. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the smokehouse plot she had purchased sat on land whose title, given these newly surfaced irregularities, might well be called into question entirely, and that a woman alone, without resources, would find a legal contest a costly and humiliating road to walk. He mentioned, too, almost as an afterthought, that Silas Coyle was a close friend of his, and that Silas had spoken of Ruth Anne's difficult temperament with some regret. Ruth Anne understood every word beneath the words. She thanked Cornelius Harlow for his time, told him she would consider his advice, and walked home with her spine straighter than it had been in weeks, because now she understood something she had only suspected before. The reason nobody in Harlow's Bend spoke of the Free family was not simple forgetting. It was a silence someone had built, brick by careful brick, the same way Emmett Free had built his own hiding place, except this silence had been built to bury a truth rather than preserve one. In the weeks that followed, the pressure mounted in small, deniable ways. The merchant who had always extended her credit for flour and salt suddenly found himself unable to do so. A man came by claiming the county wished to reassess her plot's boundaries, though he could produce no paperwork when she asked to see it. Silas Coyle himself rode out once, uninvited, to remind her that her legal standing in the county was, in his words, precarious, and that a woman who made trouble for powerful men rarely found the trouble stayed only on the men. Ruth Anne listened to every threat with the same level calm her mother had taught her to keep in the face of another family's grief, and each night, by the light of a stub of candle she rationed carefully, she copied every page of Emmett Free's ledger and every line of Mr. Pruitt's letters into a second notebook, in her own steady hand, and hid the copies in a place even Cornelius Harlow's men would never think to look, sewn, like her $11 once had been, into the lining of her second petticoat. She also began, quietly, to search for the Free family itself, writing letters to churches and freedmen's aid societies in Knoxville and Chattanooga, describing what she had found and asking whether anyone might know what had become of Emmett and Delia Free and their children after they were forced from their land. It took nearly 2 months and no small amount of patience, but in early autumn a reply came from a minister in Chattanooga who wrote that he knew of a woman, elderly now, named Cassandra Free Boyd, who had told her congregation more than once about her grandfather's smokehouse business back in a valley she called Harlow's Bend, and how the family had lost it to a rigged court case and never gotten so much as an apology. Ruth Anne wrote to Cassandra Free Boyd that very evening, enclosing a careful transcription of her grandfather's final letter. And when the reply came 3 weeks later, it was so full of weeping ink and trembling handwriting that Ruth Anne had to read it twice before she could see the words clearly through her own tears. Cassandra wrote that her grandfather Emmett had died in 1889, just the year before, still speaking of that land and that smokehouse until his last breath, still certain that somewhere, someday, the truth would surface. She had never believed she would live to see it. The town's Fall Harvest Festival that year fell in late September, an annual gathering on the courthouse green, where every family in Harlow's Bend turned out for pie contests and fiddle music and the kind of communal pride that made a small town feel, for one bright autumn afternoon, larger than it was. Ruth Anne had watched, in years past, as Josiah's wife, from a comfortable middle distance in that gathering, never quite at its center, never quite outside it either. This year, she asked the festival committee for 5 minutes to speak, and though several members hesitated, aware, as everyone by now vaguely was, that the widow Coyle had been stirring up old business, they could find no proper reason to refuse a landowner's request to address her neighbors. She stood on the courthouse steps in her one good dress, the copied ledger pages in a folder under her arm, and Cassandra Free Boyd, who had traveled 2 days by wagon and train to be there, standing quietly beside her, as she told the gathered town of Harlow's Bend the story her father's careful bookkeeping and her mother's tender attention to overlooked things had together equipped her to uncover. The story of Emmett and Delia Free, of 11 employed and 6 households fed, of a ribbon won. 3 years running at this very fair, of a survey altered by an unsteady hand to erase a rightful claim, and of a name, Free, that had been chosen on purpose by a father for his children, and then deliberately unchosen by a town that found it more convenient to forget than to reckon with what it owed. She read Emmett Free's final letter aloud in its entirety, his request that his name not be allowed to vanish from the ground his family had cleared, and when she finished, the courthouse green was silent in a way Ruth Anne had never heard it, not even at Josiah's funeral, the particular silence of a great many people realizing at once that they had all, without quite meaning to, agreed to a lie. Cornelius Harlow tried, in the days that followed, to salvage what he could, first by disputing the document's authenticity, then, when the county clerk himself confirmed the altered survey mark under oath, by claiming the whole affair predated his own stewardship and was therefore not his burden to answer for. But the town he had led for so long had heard Cassandra Free Boyd's voice too, trembling and dignified, telling them what it had cost her family to be quietly erased, and the town's patience for his excuses ran thinner with each passing week. Within the year, facing a council no longer willing to shield him and a congregation that had begun, pointedly, to seek Cassandra Free Boyd's cousins near the front of the church whenever they visited, Cornelius Harlow stepped down from the council entirely, and the disputed survey correction was formally entered into the county record, restoring the Free family's original boundary on paper. If 2 decades too late to restore the years themselves. Silas Coyle, whose fraudulent note against Ruth Anne's own farm came under fresh scrutiny once one Harlow-adjacent fraud had been proven possible, found himself facing a formal challenge to his claim as well, brought not by Ruth Anne, who wanted no more court fights than she already had, but by 3 of his own neighbors who had quietly suspected for years that his lending practices were not what they seemed, and who now, emboldened, said so plainly, Ruth Anne did not seek to reclaim the full 42 acres for herself. That had never been her intention, and she said so publicly more than once. Instead, working with Cassandra Free Boyd and 2 of the Free family's other surviving descendants, she helped establish, on the very ground behind the rebuilt Smokehouse, a modest curing cooperative in the old tradition, employing widows, freedmen's families, and anyone else the town had quietly written off as not worth counting. The very people, she often said, who understood best how to find value in things everyone else had thrown away. A new plaque was set into the chimney's rebuilt brick that winter, cut simply and without ornament, bearing the words, founded 1867 by Emmett and Delia Free, rebuilt in truth 1889. And so it happened, in the end, exactly as the old letter seal behind the chimney had hoped it might. A woman with almost nothing, a woman who had learned young that worth is not always visible to a careless eye, found in a condemned ruin the proof of a family's stolen legacy, and in restoring their name, restored something in herself as well, a place to belong, a purpose beyond mere survival, and a town that finally, however belatedly, remembered how to tell the truth about its own ground. Ruth Anne Coyle, who had been cast out with $11.40 and a foolish-seeming purchase nobody else wanted, became instead the woman who gave Harlow's Bend back a name it had spent 17 years pretending it had never known. And in doing so, she gave herself back a life worth living, built, like the Smokehouse itself, on nothing more than patient hands, an honest ledger, and the stubborn belief that nothing truly valuable is ever entirely lost, only waiting, sometimes for a very long time, to be found by someone willing to look. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Ruth and the Free family and with us. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people so often carry more worth than the world is willing to admit. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us below. We read every word. Until next time, stay close.